Chapter 6. After the terrifying night, the bright morning sun was a welcome sight. I fixed breakfast, and soon we were on our way. I tried to get the pups to follow me so as I could lighten my load. They would for a ways, and then, sitting down on their rears, they'd cry and whimper. Back in the sacks they'd go, with their heads sticking out of the holes and their long ears a-flopping, while I moved on. About midday I entered country I knew. I wasn't far from home. I dropped down out of the mountains into the bottom far above the place I had crossed the river on my way to town. Staying on the left of the river, I followed its course past several campgrounds, but didn't stop until I'd come to the place where I'd found that magazine. Here I took the pups out of the sack and sat down into the warm sand. As afternoon wore on, I sat there deep in thought. I was trying to figure out what I'd be telling my mother and father. I could think of nothing. Finally, I decided I'd just tell them the truth, and with the help of some new overalls, cloth, and candy, I'd weather that storm. My pups were having a big time playing. With their little front paws locked around each other, they were growling and rolling and chewing on each other. They looked so cute, I just laughed out loud. While I was watching them romping, the thought come over me. I hadn't named them. I went over the list of names in my head. For him, I tried Red or Bugle, Lead, name after name. And for her, I tried Susie or Mabel or Queen, all kinds of girl names, but none seemed to fit. Still mumbling names over and over, I glanced up, and there, carved in the white bark of a sycamore tree, was a large heart. And in the center of that heart was two names, Dan and Ann. The name Dan was a little larger than Ann. It was wide and bold, and the scar stood out more. The name of Ann was small, neat, and even. I stared unbelieving, for there were my names. They were perfect. I walked over and picked up my pups and looked at 'em. I said, "Your name is Dan, and I'm going to call you Old Dan." And looking at her, I said, "Your name, little girl, is Ann. I'm calling you Little Ann." It was then I realized it was all too perfect. Here in this fisherman's camp, I had found the magazine and the ad. I looked over at the old sycamore log. There was where I asked God to help me get two hound pups. There were the pups, rolling and playing in the warm sand. And I thought of the old KC baking powder can and the fishermen, how freely they gave me their nickels and dimes. I looked up again at the names carved in the tree. Yeah, it was all there like a large puzzle. Piece by piece, each fit perfectly until the puzzle was complete. It could not have happened without the help of some unseen power. I stayed at the campground until dark. I knew I had to go home, but I put it off as long as I could. The crying of the pups, telling me that they were hungry, made up my mind for me. I knew the time had come for me to face my mother and father. I sacked up my dogs, and I waded the river. As I came out of the bottoms, I could see the lamplight glow from the windows of our home. One of the small yellow squares darkened for an instant. Someone had crossed and walked across the floor. I wondered who it was. I heard Daisy, our milk cow, mooing. I was thinking so hard of what I'd say, it startled me for a second. Reaching the gate of our house, I stopped. I'd never thought of our home very pretty, but that night it looked different. It looked clean and neat and peaceful, nestled there in the foothills of the Ozarks. Yeah, on that night I was proud of our home. My bare feet made no sound as I crossed the porch. With my free hand I reached and pulled the leather that worked the latch, and slowly the door swung inward. I couldn't see my father or sisters. They were too far to the right for me, but my mother was directly in front of the door, sitting in her old cane-bottom rocker, knitting. She looked up. I saw all the worry and grief leave her eyes. Her head bowed down. The knitting in her hands came up and covered her face, and I stepped inside the room. I wanted to run to her and comfort her and tell her how sorry I was for all the worry and grief I was causing her. The booming voice of my father shook me from my trance. Well, he said, "Well, what you got there?" Laughing, he got up from his chair and came over to me. He reached and took the sack from my shoulder. "When we started looking for you," he said, "I went to the store and your grandpa told me all about it. Wasn't too hard to figure out what you had done, but you should have at least told us." I ran over to my mother and dropped to my knees, and I buried my face in her lap. As Ma patted my head, I heard her say in a quivering voice, "Oh, why didn't you tell us? Why?" Well, I couldn't answer. Between sobs, I heard the squeal of delight from my sisters as they were fondling my pups. I heard my father say, "What's this other stuff you've got here?" Without raising my head from my mother's lap in a choking voice, I said, "One is for you and one for Ma and the other's for the girls." Well, I heard the snapping of the string and the rattle of paper. The ohs and the ahs from my sister they were wonderful to hear. Pa came over to Ma. Laying the cloth on the arm of her chair, he said, "Well, you've been wanting a new dress. There's got to be enough cloth here to make a half-dozen dresses." Realizing that everything was forgiven, I stood up and dried my eyes. Pa was pretty pleased with his new overalls, and my sisters forgot the pups for the candy. The light that was shining from my mother's eyes as she fingered the cheap cotton cloth was something I'll never forget. Ma warmed some milk for the pups, and they drank until their little tummies were tight and round. And as I ate, Pa sat down at the table and started man-talking to me. "Well, how were things in town?" Well, I told him that it was boiling with people, and the wagon yard was full of wagons and teams. He asked if I seen anyone I knew. Well, I told him I hadn't, but the station master had asked about him. And he asked where I'd spent the night, and I told him about the cave in the Sparrowhawk Mountains. He said that must have been the one called Robber's Cave. My youngest sister piped up. "Did you stay all night with some robbers?" My oldest sister, "Silly, that's a long time ago. There isn't any robbers now." The other one put her nickels in worth. "Weren't you scared?" "No," I said. "I wasn't scared of staying in the cave, but I heard a mountain lion scream and it scared me half to death." "Oh, they probably wouldn't bother you. You had a fire going, didn't you?" Pa said. "Yes," I answered. "They'll never bother you unless they're wounded or cornered, but if they are, you better watch out." Pa asked me how I liked town. I said I didn't like it at all and wouldn't live there even if they gave it to me. With a querying look on his face, he said, "I'm afraid I don't understand. I thought you always wanted to go to town." "I did, but I don't want to any more. I don't like the people there, and I can't understand them." "What's wrong with them?" he asked. Well, I told him how they stared at me and even laughed and made fun of me. "Oh, I don't think they were making fun of you, were they?" "Yes, they were. And to beat it all, the boys jumped on me and knocked me down in the dirt. If it hadn't been for the marshal, I would have taken a beating." "So you met the marshal. What'd you think of him?" Well, I told him he was a nice man. He bought me a bottle of soda pop. At the mention of soda pop, the blue eyes of my sisters opened up wide. They started firing questions at me, wanting to know what color it was and what it tasted like. Well, I told them it was strawberry, and it bubbled and tickled when I drank it, and it made me burp. The eager questions of my three little sisters had an effect on my father and mother. Pa said, "Billy, I don't want you to feel badly about the people in town. I don't think they were poking fun at you. Anyway, not like you think they were." "Well, maybe they weren't. I said, but I still don't want to ever live in town. It's too crowded and you can't get a breath of fresh air. In a sober voice, my father said, "Someday you may have to live in town. Your mother and I don't intend to live in these hills all of our lives. It's no place to raise a family. A man's children should have an education. They should get out and see the world and meet some people." "I don't see why we'd have to move to town to get an education. Hasn't Ma taught us how to read and write?" "Oh, there's more to an education than just reading and writing," Pa replied. "Much more." I asked him when he thought we'd be moving to town. "Well, it'll probably be some time yet. We don't have the money now, but I'm hoping someday we will." From the stove, where she was heating salt water for my feet, Ma said in a low voice, "I'll pray every day and night for that day to come. I don't want you children to grow up without an education, not even knowing what a bottle of soda pop is or ever seeing the inside of a schoolhouse. I don't think I could stand that. I'll just keep praying, and someday the good Lord may answer my prayer." I told my mother I'd seen the schoolhouse in town. Again, I had to answer 1,000 questions for my sister. I told them it was made of red brick and was bigger than Grandpa's store, a lot bigger. There must have been at least 1,000 kids at school there. I told them all about the teeter-totters and the swings made out of log chains, the funny-looking pipe that ran up the side of the building, and how I had climbed into it and slid out like the other kids. I didn't exactly tell them how I come out, though. "I think that was a fire escape," Pa said. "A fire escape? It looked like a slide to me." "Did you notice where it made that bend up at the top?" he asked. I nodded my head. "Well, inside the school there's a door," he said. "If the school gets on fire, they open the door and the children jump into the pipe and slide out to safety." "Boy, that's a keen way of getting out of a fire," I said. "Well, it's getting late," Pa said. "We'll talk about this some other time. We better get to bed. We have a lot of work to do tomorrow." My paws were put in the corn crib for the night, and I covered them with shucks and kissed them good night. The next day was a busy one for me. With the hamper and help of my sisters, I made the little dog house. Pa cut the ends of his check lines and gave them to me for some collars. With painstaking care, deep into the tough leather, I scratched the name, Old Dan on one and Little Ann on the other. With a nail and a rock, 2 holes were punched in each end of the straps, and I put them around their necks and laced the ends together with some baling wire. That evening, I had a talk with my mother. I told her about praying for the 2 pups, about the magazine, and the plans I had made. I told her how hard I'd tried to find names for them and how strange it was to find them carved in the bark of that sycamore tree. With a smile on her face, she asked, "Do you believe God heard your prayer and helped you?" "Yes, Ma. I know He did, and I'll always be thankful." End of chapter 6.